Hello, and welcome to Bad Theology Busted, where we challenge the dangerous theology of Christian Zionism in all the places that it hides. This is the podcast of the Institute for the Study of Christian Zionism, or ISCZ. My name is Jesse, and I'm joined by my co-host and my friend, Dee.
Thanks, Jesse. We're joined by Dr. Malinda Berry, Reverend Dr. Shannon Smythe, Reverend Dr. Ross Wagner, and Reverend Emilee Walker-Cornetta. And this week we're going to go about things and talk about what Reverend Professor Mitri Raheb calls the software of the Israeli occupation of Palestine. Israel relies on two things to sustain its legal occupation of Palestine: hardware and software. The hardware is the weapons and other forms of military aid sent to Israel. But what is the software? It is the theological messaging that manufactures consent for Israel's many war crimes, including the ongoing forced starvation of children, women, and men in Gaza. This theological messaging is both consciously and unconsciously woven into the curriculum of many seminary and theology schools in the United States.
If you enjoy the show, don't forget to subscribe and leave us a review on your favorite podcast platform. We'll be back after the break to talk with you about Christian Zionism and its presence in seminaries and theology schools in the United States.
Someone once said, in the beginning God created us in His own image, and since then we've been returning the favor. And I think today many reflect their own supremacy and prejudice on the character of God. We must call for justice and accountability. The church belongs in the streets. We must call for justice and accountability. This is the path forward. We see the image of Jesus in the children of Gaza. In every child pulled from under the rubble, we see the image of Jesus. We're trying to reclaim the dignity and worth of these precious people given to them by God, yet stripped by the empire and colonization. We must call for justice and accountability. The church belongs in the streets. We must call for justice and accountability. This is the path forward.
Dr. Malinda Elizabeth Berry is a Mennonite theologian and teacher from northern Indiana, the ancestral homeland of the Miami and Potawatomi peoples. She is professor of peace theology at Anabaptist Mennonite Biblical Seminary, where she graduated with an MA in peace studies. She is also the director of the Faith Formation Collaborative, where she works to develop communities of practice that support peacemaking and justice-seeking expressions of Christian faith. Her PhD in constructive theology and social ethics is from Union Theological Seminary in the city of New York.
Reverend Dr. Shannon Smythe is Director of Field Education and Vocational Placement at Princeton Seminary and ordained clergy in the Presbyterian Church, USA. She has spent the past decade engaging in Reformed theological scholarship, teaching in both seminary and undergraduate contexts, and pastoring in congregations in New York, Delaware, and New Jersey. She is passionate about social justice, activism, and transformational faith formation. She serves on the steering committee of the Palestine Justice Network of the Presbyterian Church USA. She lives in Bucks County, Pennsylvania, with her husband, son, and her dog.
Reverend Dr. Ross Wagner is professor of New Testament at Duke Divinity School. Specializing in Paul's letters and in Septuagint studies, Professor Wagner seeks to contribute to the recovery of theological exegesis through careful investigation of the ways scriptural interpretation shaped early Jewish and Christian communities. An Anglican priest, he serves as volunteer clergy in a local parish and takes an active part in the Anglican Episcopal House of Studies.
Reverend Emilee Walker-Cornetta is an Episcopal priest and executive director at Episcopal Divinity School. Prior to that, she was coordinator of spiritual care at a hospital in New York City and co-authored several articles and chapters about improving healthcare-based spiritual care for marginalized communities. Emilee holds an STM from EDS at Union Theological Seminary and an MDiv from Princeton Theological Seminary. She is involved in local multi-faith organizing for Palestine in Atlanta, Georgia, where she lives with her family.
So again, thank you all so much for being with us today. Let's dive right in. As Mitri Raheb has described it, seminaries and theology schools are the institutions creating the software necessary to perpetuate the ongoing occupation of Palestine and the continued genocide in Gaza. The theology coming out of these places of higher education creates the manufactured consent or theological cover necessary for Israel to continue its aggression with impunity. So tell me, how do you see this playing out in each of your social locations?
Coming from this theological tradition of Anabaptism and being part of a Mennonite denomination, while also remembering that no group is monolithic. In my world, Mennonites hold to some very deep theological values about God's care for and interest in the entire planet and its many peoples, cultures, and ways of being. We also hold a very deep critique of what we call the state, because we don't see the state apparatus, as we sometimes like to call it, arranging itself according to the reign of God. And we read Jesus as being very serious about when you have to make a decision, do you adhere to the politics of the worldly kingdoms or God's eternal kingdom? Well, I mean, there's no question there as far as Jesus is concerned. That position has oftentimes, relegated us to the margins of broader conversations around theology and ethics. What gets baked into this kind of worldview is a very high view of peoplehood and community that transcends national boundaries and commitments. And then that we pair that with a very low view of patriotism and ethnically based nationalism. So what this means in terms of this question about hardware and software of Christian Zionism, in the landscape that I come from, Christian Zionism has not been part of how we do theology and how we read what's going on in Israel-Palestine, in some of the conversations I find myself in. Because we tend to shun nationalistic projects, you didn't hear a lot about Christian Zionism unless you were in a community that had been impacted by evangelicalism. Part of why I'm in this conversation, or why this conversation matters to me and the people that I relate to, is because we need to be prepared to respond to the way Christian Zionism shows up in the dominant, or I would say loudest, biggest, most influential forms of Christianity, because we also tend to stay away from theology. We're a biblical seminary, not a theological seminary, and so really needing to think through, well, what is our theology of religions? What do we think about the relationship between the covenants that God makes to what becomes the Jewish community and then Christian community? There's a lot of unexamined, embedded theology about this that people aren't even really talking about.
I'll jump in. I'm also a little bit differently situated in the sense that I'm not situated within a kind of traditional academic seminary. From my vantage point, I see a couple of things. So I'm connected to a lot of progressive mainline clergy, I would say, mostly Episcopalian, but not all Episcopalian. And in the past couple of years, I've been having a lot of conversation with folks in very progressive spaces who are kind of vocally, actively, out loud committed to a lot of justice issues and doing political advocacy around all kinds of things in the past couple of years, noticing like a very, as you all have, a very loud silence around Palestine, which has, made me feel a lot of things. One of the many responses is curiosity, and been having conversation with people, seminary trained clergy and leaders within churches about kind of what's going on with that silence and what's underneath it and behind it. And one thing I've heard from a lot of people is that people have expressed to me not a lack of care or concern, but simply a feeling and experience of being incapacitated, like unresourced to engage in these conversations, like feeling like I don't have the tools, I don't have the framework, I don't have the analysis, I don't really know how to engage this theologically. And one thing that's come up in those conversations is that I think that in a lot of like seminaries and theological schools, something we do learn, and it's a good thing that we do learn. I think a lot of times this shows up in intro to New Testament classes is, we learn about the entrenched anti-Jewishness in the Christian tradition. We learn about how that shows up in in the New Testament. We learn about how that has shown up in our tradition over time, how it shows up in our liturgies and in our theologies, how all this horrible Christian theology helped manufacture the Holocaust. And because of that awareness, that sort of like ingrained awareness, there's a hesitancy and a real caution to kind of practice or make some kind of public Christian witness that will get accusations of anti-Semitism from the mainstream Jewish community. I want to affirm that as a good thing. The hesitancy, like when it's a good faith impulse to kind of like pause and check oneself, where historically Christians have gotten it really, really wrong. And I don't think that the political weaponization of anti-Semitism should like take that away from us either. Like I tend to think that it's like that we almost don't take the conversation and the analysis about that far enough, particularly in terms of its intersections with broader, white Christian supremacy and colonialism. We teach it in isolation.
Yeah, Emilee, I could say you almost have described my own faith and intellectual journey. I'm deeply affected by co-teaching a course at Princeton Seminary with a colleague on the history of Christian anti-Judaism and the way it has misshapen scriptural interpretation and preaching. And I agree with you. Christians in the West can't think too much about that. And yet, so much of that discussion never challenged for me the formation I had in a mainline Methodist church growing up in Northeast Ohio that equated duty to God and country, as the Boy Scouts taught me, sponsored by my church. Ways in which a kind of nationalism, militarism just seemed part and parcel of Christianity. And so for complicated reasons, Americans of my generation at least grew up thinking of Israel as our partner in the Middle East. This whole notion of a Judeo-Christian tradition is really sort of invented early in the Cold War. And it becomes a justification for seeing ourselves in Israel and seeing in Israel something of our own story. I think the kind of Christian formation that the seminaries I've been involved in, Princeton and Duke, I don't think is intentional enough to overcome this kind of formation from the culture. And much of our seminary curriculum is piecemeal so that we never make the connections that you're talking about. Yeah, thank you. I just found that really illuminating. And starting to understand what the pieces of the problem are then help us think about how we could respond in a way that doesn't turn the clock back on Christian attitudes toward Judaism. But I've learned so much from Jewish voices speaking out in the last couple years, where I felt like thinking theologically with Jews as a Christian is pretty exciting and also an important way forward to try to check these impulses toward a Christian triumphalism.
In my clergy context, where I am in the Northeast, some of us who are a part of the Palestine Justice Network, for example, talk about the Jewish theologian Mark Ellis's insightful analysis of what he calls the ecumenical deal, where, coming out of the guilt and the shame and the rightful horror and reorientation of Christian clergy and certainly Christian theologians that play a big role and have a big lineage and connection to Princeton Seminary, where I work. Folks are coming together and saying, how do we have interfaith relationships anymore? How can we work together with our interfaith clergy? Well, the ecumenical deal is, we can make this work if, rabbis are not going to make the Christian clergy feel guilty over their part and contribution to everything that led to the Holocaust, right? Turning away the Jewish folks from country after country. And they're not going to, in return, say a word about anything about occupied Palestine. And we find that dynamic operates pretty strongly, progressive except for Palestine, like you were indicating, Emilee. How do you unravel that when we go back to the legacy of these theological institutions and denominations, which maybe we can cordon off the Mennonite tradition and seminaries, but certainly the Reformed and Presbyterian are right in the mix of the white settler colonial project that, brought about the denominations and the seminaries that were there as their training schools to kind of lead into a mission that is kind of very interwoven with a colonial, capitalistic, militaristic culture that we're not interrogating. So we do have these very piecemeal experiences that folks might have in this course or another, but not overall. Our institutions aren't denouncing the colonial project in which they were arisen. Are we really going to rebuild? What are we going to sacrifice to do something different, to follow Mitri Raheb calling into question, right, these Western colonial ideas that are at the very base and foundation of our theological training schools? Why are we surprised that our Christian clergy in great numbers, at least within certain mainline denominations, are remaining silent and are not speaking out, and henceforth the congregations and congregants as well?
Yeah, you mentioned, and I'm a systems person, and I was talking to one of our local to Atlanta Quaker friends who said that right now their PR is really great on this issue, and they've had lots of mainline Protestant people coming into their meetings with righteous rage at the silence of their communities on what's happening in Palestine. And this person just sort of joked at me and he said, that's great for us. That's great for Quakerism. And I'm really concerned for mainline Protestantism. And I think that, I had such a gift last month being able to speak with Mitri and some other panelists about what does theology after Gaza even look like. And two things came out of that conversation. One, our good friend Christine Pei mentioned, she said, I don't know if the Anglican Church is supposed to survive after this. I don't know if we're supposed to survive. And so I think that's a question that are we meant to survive? And then the other thing that happened in that conversation was Mitri going back to the ecumenical deal and saying that it's no longer sufficient. Mark Ellis's ecumenical deal doesn't work anymore. And it's now time for Christian clergy to go to their Jewish neighbors and have a very critical conversation about what's happening. And I'll just add that some of my favorite anti-Zionist Jewish scholars are no longer using anti-Semitism, and they're starting to use the term anti-Jewish hatred in order to explain what's actually happening, because anti-Semitism is no longer sufficient in its weaponized reality right now.
Right, what you were saying, Shannon, about, recalling, especially the Presbyterian, Anglican, the mainline traditions being part of the American colonial project from its inception. And it reminded me of, if you haven't read Usama Makdisi, phenomenal scholar. He's actually the nephew of Edward Said, and he teaches here in Berkeley now. But he has two books, because he's also part of a major Protestant, like sort of the lineage of a major Lebanese Protestant family associated with the National Church there. And so I got connected to him through his work in Lebanon, but he has 2 books, Artillery of Heaven, and then Faith Misplaced. And he explores that because he looks at American frontier missions and missionaries going out and then how that translated into, okay, well, whatever dead end we're hitting with the natives, or even if they do convert, they're still getting kicked off their land. Let's go overseas and do missions work. But then him being Middle Eastern really gets into what that looked like, what that Protestant missions work looked like on the ground, and just fascinating work in that analysis of colonialism and missions.
Yeah, I want to jump in here with a little conceptual tool that comes to us from the work of Mennonite conflict transformation specialist Betty Priest. And she, in her book, The Space Between Us, she talks about the architecture of the self, how we all have a descriptive self, and then there's the defended self and the deeper self. But this architecture of selfhood operates in cultures and societies that tend to orient us toward what she and others have described as diagonal arguments. So if you imagine this kind of a grid of 4 quadrants, in the top half of that quadrant is the pros, and then the bottom half of the quadrant are the cons. And what typically will happen is I will champion everything that is positive and beneficial about my way of seeing things up here, and then everything that is awful and terrible about your ideas, right? So I form a diagonal. Like, my idea is only awesome, your idea is only terrible. And then, of course, because that is going to activate your defended self, you're going to say, oh yeah, well, my idea is only awesome and your idea is only terrible. And that what happens with these diagonal arguments is that the naturally occurring polarities that just exist as part of creation, I'll put it that way. Like, we have nocturnal animals and diurnal animals. They don't come out and do their thing at the same time of day. Well, that underlying polarity becomes polarized when diurnal animals are better than nocturnal animals, right? Like, and we get into this diagonal argument. And I feel like that is part of, well, one of my little phrases is the devil be crafty like that. Because I'm a Walter Wink person. And I think there is something to the spiritual dimension of reality and the domination system that really convinces us that whenever there's a conflict, either you're wrong and I'm right, or I'm wrong and you're right, right? It's this sort of shame-blame cycle. And so one of the things that I'm interested in is how analyzing the challenges that manifest in Christian Zionism, for example, are an invitation to us to figure out how to break out of this diagonal arguing that just intensifies the polarities, that I think the invitation is for us to manage creatively and invite God's love to transform and help us break through. Like, the history books are very clear, right? That this identity of the Ashkenazi Jew is sort of, how cemented is that to this physical place? We don't know. But I'm being confronted by a person whose self-understanding is that they are indigenous to Judea and Samaria. And it occurs to me, I realize that some of what's going on as we're in these conversations is, they are thinking about themselves in the same way as the Potawatomi and Miami people I have met, as AMBS is trying to dismantle the doctrine of discovery and how that has shaped our institutional sense of place and ownership and identity. And that doesn't fit neatly into my diagonal argument thing. So there is something, I think, about trying to figure out how we humanize one another, how we avoid using what we might describe as sort of trigger words. Part of what I also learned in the dialogue that we had in the West Bank is that for my Palestinian theological colleagues, the words Jewish and Israel are trigger words. And I am so grateful to them and their vulnerability in sharing that with us. That was not the first thing out of their mouth. We got to that like multiple days into our dialogue. And now I'm sitting here sort of wrestling with this question, well, how on earth do you read the Bible? And how do you remain faithful to what Emilee was describing as the kind of awareness of anti-Semitism in Western Christian tradition that taught us to remember that Jesus is Jewish? How do I live in that reality? How do I read the Psalms that talk about Israel and know that every time those words come out of my mouth, it is at least energetically activating people who I pray for because we share in the body of Christ in particular ways. Like, that's the kind of dialogue that I'm interested in. If anything keeps me up at night, like that's the thing that keeps me up at night. And I wish that we could find ways to nurture these conversations, because I find the necessary but limited language of protest to be insufficient for the kind of deep meaning making that I think will ultimately help us exercise Christian Zionism from the church.
As a queer person here, I'm going to say, please, dear God, can we get out of binary frameworks of thinking? And I think that that is the only way that we're going to struggle through this together, is by getting out of a binary framework that traps people in boxes. So thank you for saying that.
On the one hand, I think you're 100% correct. There are trigger words, there are shutdown words, there are binary thinking, and actually the work of like Salim Munayer and Lisa Loden with the Musallaha works very strongly on digging into these contradictory historical narratives and identity formation and theological formation, bringing a Palestinian Christian and a Messianic Jewish person together at first, and then expanded to the larger Israeli and Palestinian and Muslim societies. It's really, really deep, really hard-looking work. And yet, and I think they're doing wonderful. Salim's kids, the Munayer brothers, are like on fire and doing phenomenal. But I've also seen how dual narrative talk has led to silencing, especially with Israel-Palestine, where Palestinians, their experience of living under occupation, of displacement, gets dismissed as, well, that's your narrative and I have a different narrative. And when you look into narratives, and even one of the history books I read a few years back specifically was, here's a Palestinian writing the history of the situation and conflict, and here's an Israeli writing the history of the conflict. Fascinating. But at the end of the day, one side was justifying their control and their power and their claim to a land that they did not yet inhabit and wanted to inhabit, and the other was narrating their experience of dispossession. Not all narratives are created equal, is sort of what I came to experience. They may be essential in identity formation. Like, you're talking to a person who their identity is so closely tied to Israel, and yet they're living in North America, their family might be from Europe. So you take that to a Palestinian whose family is from the land, perhaps never come from anywhere else, and is now being told, you're the foreigner here. This is mine. And how they're supposed to respond to that person who thinks of themselves as indigenous to Judea and Samaria, and they're like, I'm sorry, you're just not. Maybe I'm just not getting the full idea.
Let me maybe offer this, Jesse. Because you're right. Part of what I'm trying to advocate for is, where and how do we depolarize the arena so that this delta can be dealt with? And maybe one way to do it, because I'm also, my perspective on this has also been informed by Robin Wall Kimmerer, who is a Potawatomi botanist and biologist who's in upstate New York, and can explain how she ended up there because of the Carlisle Indian School and her dad ending up in the military and these kinds of things. But she talks about becoming naturalized to place. What does it mean to be in diaspora? How does one naturalize to place? Because I think that without that, there's a level at which I, as the descendant of enslaved people and peacemaking settlers who came in after everybody else in the mainline did the dirty work of clearing the land, that conversation about being naturalized to place is very, very different for me than it is for somebody who is Jewish, who has been morally formed and taught to pray for a land that they have never lived in. I don't know what that does to a person, but what I see in the political landscape is that for a lot of people, it's done some pretty powerful work.
I mean, I think in some part I hear what you're saying and longing for, and I appreciate the gesture, Jesse, that you made to Masala and the incredible work of the Munir family and the power that is in a particular kind of biblical reconciliation model that really gets down at the very granular level of people's lives and narratives and the way that they've been shaped. At the same time, I can't help thinking of folks within Judaism who give a different narrative of having been, a product of the propaganda machine. We get those testimonies in Israelism and in some of the writings that are coming out right now. And so I think that we can't lose a hold on the truth, the role of the truth. I know everyone's going to contest the truth, but I am going to hold to some historical facts on the ground that have happened that have to be reckoned with. And I don't know how we can get anywhere if that piece is not centralized in all of our discussions. And I think that's what can be missing very quickly, and what Palestinians are rightly very quickly to show us is no one, at least in where I sit in my institution, really wants to wrestle with the facts on the ground of what happened leading up to, from doctrine of discovery and manifest destiny all the way to the creation of the state of Israel post-World War II, and everything that came after with German and Western, Protestant, Presbyterian, Reformed theologians not wrestling with that whatsoever, but instead using theology and God's providence to justify what had happened. Period. End of story. We're not going to go any further. And then anytime there's any kind of poking at that, then we have this, we can't get anywhere because we're anti-Semitic. And then it becomes what you were noting in the space between us in the, what the academy likes to do and what is so right about my position and what is so wrong about your position. And we get nowhere. And folks are silenced, and we've never reckoned with the truth. So I don't know. The systems and things in place in the world, I think, make it hard for me to only stay on the individual granular level, as important as it is, so that we can have dialogue and we can get away from dehumanizing, which is such a beautiful, important point at this point in time.
Yeah, I mean, we all have a need for shared reality as humans.
Yeah.
And it is so difficult to get that need met. As a theologian, I'm deeply, deeply troubled and challenged by that we can't even agree on sort of what's central to the gospel. Because I don't think that central to the gospel is Jews being in charge of Israel so that Jesus can come back again. Like that does what? Huh?
So that actually leads me to another question, although we've already been touching upon this through such a rich conversation. But it leads me to another question that we had written and sent out in advance. And it's when people think of Christian Zionism, it is assumed that those with this belief come from a conservative, charismatic, or evangelical tradition. However, over the past 2 years, a veil has been removed from liberal Christian spaces. At best, many of these liberal Christian Zionist institutions have been reluctant to acknowledge or address the harm that's being done. At the worst, they have been fully complicit in the destruction of Palestinian life. Where do you see these liberal Christian Zionist assumptions being woven into the fabric of the curriculums of theology schools?
Let me answer your question by not answering it in one sense. I think in some ways, the questions are not raised because I'll blame my own discipline of biblical studies. It is so often taught, even in a seminary setting, as a historical discipline. We teach a historical criticism that tends to distance ourselves, our students, from the text, and we'll leave it to our colleagues in ethics and theology to talk about what does it mean today. And that's a caricature, but it does mean that we give a lot of attention to the history of ancient Israel, the biblical history of ancient Israel, the way historians might reconstruct a different story, but don't draw the connections for our students to modern mythologies and stories around Israel. And so I think there's a lack of attention to the interconnections that's kind of baked into the traditional theological curriculum that's still former dean at Princeton Seminary. He said a number of times in the hearing of the faculty, we don't have a curriculum, we have a treaty. Each discipline gets its section of the MDiv, and we don't really kind of look at the connections. And I think that's widely true, that we imagine someone else is helping our students make these connections. I think we've already named, too, the way in which for mainline churches we're necessarily attentive to the ways that Christian theology has mischaracterized, has done violence to Jewish life, faith, practice. There's a reluctance to challenge this ecumenical bargain that we mentioned. The role of Christians is to not criticize Israel, because to do so would be probably to put our foot in our mouth, which I may well have done already here. I think the last piece I would mention, and this is what I think is actually making some difference, is that as faculty, as we bring our students into contact with Palestinian brothers and sisters, with Christians in the Middle East more widely, we start learning through those relationships that things look a lot different there. And the kind of testimony that comes from just listening to believers in Palestine, or nearby in Egypt, in Lebanon, that I've seen for myself and my students probably moves us faster and further than any kind of book or lecture.
I think one thing we've already named here too is, Ross, you said earlier, this kind of parallel between, and Mitri Raheb has pointed this out, this kind of parallelism between the US and Israel. I think the way that Mitri Raheb puts it in his book is like, when the US looks in the mirror, it sees Israel. When Israel looks in the mirror, it sees the US. And this kind of, I think that in the US, white people in the US in particular, and US institutions, there's just this great deal of hesitancy. I think a lot of it is unconscious. It's like we've been sort of disciplined to not seriously engage our own history of settler colonialism and genocide and enslavement, like to just not, to like probe this far and not too much further. And so insofar as we're still, I think, white America, the United States, and also our institutions are still kind of under this like enchantment. We're still enchanted by our own narrative of manifest destiny. We're sympathetic to Israel insofar as we're sympathetic to ourselves. And that just kind of dictates, like it sort of informs and dictates our public discourse and the conversations that are possible and encouraged, I guess, in institutions of higher education and supported and prioritized. So I think all of that on the level of culture and kind of in institutions and also individual psyches, like all of that from the personal to the systemic is just still really strongly and powerfully at play here in terms of how these institutions and our schools function and how the risks that we're willing to take and looking at ourselves, I mean, really fundamentally.
My 8th grade history teacher, his thesis of the class was that people are basically bad. He's like, I have a life philosophy. This is what it is. And as we studied world history, he would come back around and say, see what I said? People are basically bad. And there was part of me that really wanted him to be wrong. But like, this is part of how he taught us about World War II, right? People are basically bad. And that the Holocaust represented the epitome or the pinnacle of human failure. But he also loves America. I mean, he was also very clear about loving America. And so I think that part of this is also just the paradox of being human, Jesse. I mean, so I don't always know quite how to, I really want deeply to be able to diagnose the problems. I mean, that's why I'm an academic, right? Because that seems to me the clearest pathway to sort of surgically removing this idea and putting this one in, and maybe the body politic will function in a more humane way, and my 8th grade history teacher will be proved wrong. And so I think that you're right, that there are these kind of caricaturish ways that Christian Zionism shows up in the body politic. I'm a yoga person and my husband's a massage therapist. We also talk about the subtle body. And so you're talking about the subtle forms of Christian Zionism that just kind of live in the fascia of this country, Emilee, as you were saying. But I also want to kind of try to figure out, how do we get out of the diagonal argument of some of that? Because, like the nation of Liberia, it was a colonizing society that was led by white and black people. So, we could go back and say, well, they wouldn't have had to create this colonizing society. I don't quite remember the name of it, if white people hadn't enslaved black people in the first place. But I was also taught to read the history of the African continent as a place where there was a slave trade. It just went on steroids when the Europeans showed up with some of their hardware and some of their software. So I think another one of my struggles is that I do believe deeply that what has happened in Gaza, what continues to happen in Gaza, what is happening in the West Bank, like, it's atrocious, and I want it to stop, and I believe that it rends God's heart on a daily basis. But I also am trying to make sense of what I know of who humans are, and that none of this is new. And so help me out, friends. Like, what do we do with that? That's a kind of polarity, right? There is something pressing in this moment that calls us to speak up, speak out, and break through this artificial harmony that there's nothing to see here with what we know to be true, that there is something deeply broken in the world that would allow people to drop bombs on other human beings and celebrate it. And that millions of us feel some shame because we are sort of stuck in these shame spirals because we don't really know what to do and what to say and how to be.
One thing that comes to mind, I'm drawn back to, Malinda, your, I thought, really kind of powerful invitations around diagonal arguments and kind of non-binary ways to approach these conversations, the power of having personal encounters with people across difference and actually making space for yourself, within oneself, to really see another person and hear their story. Like, I found all that very powerful and compelling. And it made me think, and I'm thinking about now, even as we think about the US and our own kind of cultural kind of unwillingness or resistance or incapacity to really probe the history and hold the truth, is this other kind of binary between the level of the personal and the individual and the human and the relational, and also the historical view and questions of power and different kinds of power, political power, economic power, military power. It's almost like we can have the conversation on this level up here, or we can have it face to face. I can make space for you as a person. We can have a personal conversation, or we can have a sort of political or historical or kind of like analytical or even theological conversation. But it's really hard for us to hold both at the same time. And I think we have this kind of it's like good guy, well, if I make space for you, if I make space for this story and I see you as a real person and I can feel love for you, it kind of disrupts this whole good guy, bad guy narrative. And I think in the US too, it's like a lot of people are like, well, if I actually make space for this sort of analysis or this kind of truth telling about the history of this country, well, what does that mean about my great-great-grandfather who, you know what I mean? There's this difficulty and incapacity. It's also a lack of practice. And like even modeling about how to hold both of these, how to exist on both of these planes at the same time. And we can be here and we can be here. We need more practice. We need skills. We need good examples, how to do this, how to be in both spaces at once.
You have hit the thing that frustrates me the most about organizing in spaces that are progressive on Palestine. And one of our colleagues, Addie, has come up with the other acronyms. So you have like PEP, Progressive Accept Palestine, but you also have the POOPs. But she has a 3-year-old, so that's where they are, but progressive only on Palestine, right? And so I think that as a queer person in this movement, like I exist both deeply in the personal and deeply in the political, all at the same time, all at once, and I cannot get out of it. I cannot get out of it. And I think that, truly, there are some spaces that are very progressive on Palestine that still think I am an abomination that should be damned to hell, right? And so, really my answer to that is queer theory. My answer to that is really to live into what it means, free Palestine. A lot of people accuse us of only meaning the liberation of one group of people that are called the Palestinian people, right? And what we mean by free Palestine is free every single person who is currently under occupation of any kind throughout the entire world. And to go back to the Bible here, which, Jesse, I'm going to swap places with you in this moment, getting us back to biblical grounds. But in several of our conversations with other people for other episodes so far, once God says that everyone is imago Dei, once everyone is created in God's image, you can't go backwards and say, oh, well, only these people are created in God's image. So really, that is the foundation of the gospel narrative. And we can't agree as Christian people that truly indeed everybody is created in the divine image of God. So be more receptive to queer people in your spaces and stop making us feel like we have to leave a fraction ourselves out when we come into these organizing spaces.
That's a powerful statement, Dee. It gets me thinking about these models of, and Ross, I'm kind of curious what you make of some of the kind of contemporary moves that people make as we try to read and eat the scroll and weave it into the fabric of our lives in the 21st century. Where some people talk about, rather than the kingdom of God with a G, it's the kingdom of God, to try to help us become naturalized to place or honor indigenous ways of knowing that understand humans as woven into the fabric of creation, rather than being, at the pinnacle of creation and being able to dominate it. Because part of what happens, I think you're right, Dee, when you accept the Imago Dei principle, to dehumanize somebody, you compare them to animals, right? Because animals are lower down on the chain of being. And in a kinship reading, hey, actually, the trees are just as good at communicating as humans. The dolphins are just as good at communicating as the humans. The ocean has a voice and it cries out and it erupts in tsunamis and hurricanes. And so then to make the connection to Palestine, I think it is important that we remember that the liberation theology coming out of Palestine understands itself as indigenous in multiple ways, and that includes offering us this expansive way of thinking about who and what God is interested in. And God is interested in us understanding ourselves as kin. But like I recognize that that is also deeply in tension with some of the biblical voices that are very clear that no, like there is, like Yahweh is sovereign over all the other gods. Like there is a hierarchy here.
I'm struck by the development of Palestinian theology from Naim Atik, the stream that comes out of his seminal work, is relentlessly Christological. I mean, this claim that we know who God is by seeing the human face of Jesus, which is to know what Imago Dei is to look at Christ. To know what it is to say that God is king is to look at what sort of king is Jesus, the Palestinian Jew. And I think my reluctance to give up the kingdom language is that I think it's good news for us that Jesus is at God's right hand, the one whose power is shown in his giving himself for us, the one whose exercise of power is an acceptance of weakness, the one in whom love becomes the ultimate end of the story. And I think it's not to reduce everything to Christology, but with this Christological center, then I think we're invited to see the human being as in relationship with all of creation. And Colossians says that Christ is the firstborn of all of creation, or Ephesians says, in him all things hold together. You are quoting Psalms, the trees of the field will clap their hands, Isaiah, or the waters shout and roar. It's not an either or. If we rightly understand what sort of king Jesus is, we realize, wow, we are called now sisters and brothers of this one. We are put into a new relationship with all of creation that now holds together in Christ. One of the places I've seen this exposited in a really exciting way, Willie James Jennings, my former colleague at Duke, now professor at Yale, has an amazing commentary on the book of Acts. And he actually uses the term kingdom, which is what made me think of it. But as Dr. Jennings just unfolds what the shape of this early community is like, filled with the Spirit, proclaiming in an embodied way the good news of the God who shows up for us in Jesus Christ. Lots of books we're mentioning, but that is one to kind of dwell with, to open the book of Acts and to open Dr. Jennings' commentary. Because I think you can, for someone like me who's grown up with this kind of militaristic Christ that comes through in overt and subtle ways, to go back to the New Testament text with the help of a wise interpreter like Jennings is really a gift.
So I just want to shout out actually that Dr. Jennings was the delegation leader for Sabile on the trip that Dr. Berry just returned from. So he's a very good friend of all of us and a phenomenal scholar, of course.
Can I jump on the wagon with the Dr. Jennings fan club? Because I think there's been some things he said more recently that have been really helpful. In addition to the Acts commentary where he gives us a vision of a God who desires to join us together and to join us to the divine life, which, all the things that we would put in the way of that joining, God is in the business of disrupting in the most powerful way. I think that has a lot of instruction for the conversation that we have been having. I also noted with real interest the way, taking some framing that he had to Howard Thurman's reaction of being in the land of occupied Palestine and in Israel, and noting the deep sadness of the land and not wanting to return, which he drew on in a lecture he gave, I think, within the past year or so. He used a lot of framework of the challenge and problem of Christian Zionism is trying to see through the suffering of others to get to some hope right? And the ancient roots of that within Christianity. And so that reminds me, Emilee, of what you were talking about in terms of the challenge people have holding these dimensions together. And what we must never do, he says, is to see through the suffering of the Palestinians, right? That is the danger that in that thread that exists from Christian Zionism from its early proto days to the future. And I think some of the things that we've all been talking about is how do you do that in a theological institution? How do you do that in an institutional setting where the very notion of valuing indigenous land, indigenous people, indigenous ways of knowing gets framed in these Western notions of academic scholarship and power over and domination of the other? That lends itself to seeing through the suffering of others. And I worry very much about the way that we are shaped and formed, malformed and deformed through the ways that we're uncritical in the seminary spaces of engaging one another, engaging the thoughts of others, in how much priority do we give to various liberation theologies. I can say from my own time to what I hear students come into my office and report to this very day is that there is an academic sparring, things are contested, and folks will dismiss in their either refusal to hear or their kind of pride and arrogance. And that just continues to go over and over and over again. And how is that seen through the suffering of others? Because those liberation theologies, in one key respect, are constantly highlighting the suffering of the communities out of which they come. And that gets dismissed again and again and again in an institution that's just guided by these Western ways of knowing and being. How do we get to that God who desires us and who wants to join us to one another? I don't think our classroom spaces in these institutions are designed for that. Certainly when we can bring in and prioritize these other voices. But certainly I would say, speaking with my field education hat on, there's something very powerful that's missing when we don't go do what the Munir brothers suggest, which is they say, come walk with us in the olive trees. What if seminary education was more like that? Walking together under the olive trees? How might our bodies metabolize our learning and our transformation through the power of the Spirit for something completely different, which might lead us to move past seeing through the suffering of others into something much more radical?
You have led us into where I'd like to conclude this conversation is, given this awful, not excellent space that we're in, where we're not sort of embodying the learning and doing this, like, what are the opportunities? Do you see opportunities for sort of correcting or redirecting this energy to get out of the like Christian Zionist heresy that it is? Like, what are the ways in which we can make modifications, change the way we do theological education? Do you see any opportunities and spaces to get us out of this quagmire that we are finding ourselves in? And to quote somebody very local to my context here at Candler, like, is this the death of theological education? Like, is Gaza going to be the thing that forces us? Maybe the death might be very slow over lots of decades. As we all know, academia works at a snail's glacial pace. But, you know, the death might be slow, but like, is this a warranted impetus for the death and resurrection of theological education? And I'm just curious to hear from all of you. Do you think if we can figure out how to walk together through the suffering of our communities, is there hope on the other side? What does the hope on the other side look like? And how do we deal with this deep theological problem that just keeps continuing?
I'd like to start because I want to go back to what Ross and Shannon were saying moments ago. What I love is that this conversation is so poetic and thoughtful. And what I'm reminded of in their comments is the kenosis, that in Jesus, God is emptying God's self of power and might. I mean, like there is the depth of the vulnerability of the incarnation, as Ross was saying. If that is the cornerstone of theological education, then my answer is no. Like, I don't want theological education to die. I'm gonna, if it's on ventilation, I'm gonna keep saying my prayers. Because I think that Shannon's incisive analysis, that is also a really important truth to hold on to, that there is some relinquishing of power that must happen. And again, this is a very, very challenging proposition for people who have invested so much of their time and energy and life force into gaining and building a reputation for themselves and being in a place of honor and prestige and power and influence in our society. So I think for me, the way I want to kind of reframe your question, Dee, or the way I want to respond to it at least, is to say, going back to what Emilee was talking about, I wish that we could reconstruct the concept of reconciliation, because again, what I see in the cross, and I'm getting this out of Toni Morrison, is that you've got this perpendicular line, a line that shows up in cave paintings all over the world. And it's a human figure that is poised to embrace. That the reality of that we live is cruciform, like here I am as this beloved child of God, but I am also ensnared in these systems that like move me in the other direction. And so in Christ, if all things hold together, the individual level, the systems level, where is that sweet spot in which we can manifest love, where we can say that relinquishing power doesn't make me smaller or make me less. It, in fact, increases my isness and it increases God's isness. That's my response. But again, by weaving together where I think this conversation has brought us, and hopefully will take the listeners too.
I love the phrase increasing isness. I'm going to hold on to that. Thank you. So at Episcopal Divinity School, where I work, we are engaging in a lot of conversations right now about decolonizing theological education. What does that mean? What does that mean? It means so many things. EDS is a historic seminary that's currently kind of building itself anew outside the bounds of traditional accredited theological education. So because of that, we have a good deal of room to play and experiment and are really trying to steward that freedom well. And thinking about this in all kinds of ways in terms of who gets to be in the room, what do we need to relinquish, what needs to die, what kind of kenosis needs to happen, what does decolonial pedagogy look like, how do we give preference to the embodied and the local, how do we walk with others under the olive trees, like all these things. And of course, we don't have answers, but are asking questions and in conversation. And there's so many good educators and scholars and practitioners around the world that are thinking about this so much right now in really imaginative and creative ways. One thing that comes to mind in response to your question, Dee, and it's a very practical thing. And as I'm about to say it, I can sort of imagine the eyes rolling, like I feel like as people listen. But one thing I learned last year when I interviewed student activists for Palestine at seminaries and divinity schools across the country is that they had a very clear sense of why Palestine mattered to them as American Christians, its intersections with all the other things that they were learning in seminary, and also how their schools, how their institutions could create space and support this kind of theological exploration and formation. I mean, just one idea that comes to mind is like inviting some students into the conversation about what this would actually look like. How could schools create space, offer support, try on some new things, And I know all the things about how this isn't necessarily an easy or simple thing to do. And I think it's really important. A lot of these students have great ideas about what's possible and like how to try things that are a little bit outside of the bound, outside how we traditionally do things, and inviting them in to dream about what's possible, and not just possible, but needed, like crucially needed, is one place to start.
I want to jump in a little bit. I still want to hear everyone's thoughts on this, but it just reminded me of, we came with these questions with a very legitimate sort of negative assessment of traditional theological education. And yet I also look back to my own experience in seminary. And among here, I'm probably the only one here who went to an evangelical seminary, which was Fuller Theological Seminary, which is, it's almost also a Presbyterian seminary if when you scratch the surface. But I didn't have the language or the tools to even think about things in this way without my theological training, to assess the way in which I was sort of formed. Seemed like there was just a little too many questions I wasn't having answers for, or so very, enmeshed in our nationalism, et cetera, et cetera. I didn't have the language for that, and seminary helped that. And also, that's also where I got connected with Dr. Martin Akkad, who's a Lebanese scholar, who's has very strong opinions, having lived under the reign of Israeli bombs, as a Christian scholar. And also, it is at Fuller where I had a course with Salim Munayer, who very much, it's where I first read and then met Colin Chapman. It's where I first met and got the books and eventually read Stephen Sizer. This is where I first met and then helped organize a conference with Don Wagner. And these are key influential names. And it was because of my evangelical seminary in Southern California that I got connected. And Dr. Mark Laverton was not president at the time, but he was my pastor when I was up here in Berkeley. But then he became president, and then he gave devotions at Christ at the Checkpoint. So on the one hand, do I think Fuller is a shining example of anti-Zionist education? Not at all. There were pockets within it that I think put people in the right direction. There's so much more that can be done. But I also, in a way, think of the seminary experience also as very constructive in my deconstruction, in a sense.
I went to seminary, and that's where I became a leftist. like going to seminary was where, I went to Palestine for the first time in seminary. So, it's not to take a thing off of Mitri Raheb. It's not all bad. There are some pockets and glimmers of goodness within theological education. And I think that the last 2 years specifically have kind of, as we said, taken off that veil of we have to have these conversations. We have to start having these conversations. And Emilee, I just want to name the students. My hope is the students. The students, they teach me so much, and it's such a gift. And so I will raise that as really listening and really taking stock of what the students are saying and using that data informed narrative information to make changes in the way we operate. I really truly think that that's a great place to start.
I'll just say, and not just because I want to keep my job, I'm really grateful to be at Duke Divinity School. I have colleagues with wide ranges of interest and experience and specialization are just so deeply serious about wanting to see the gospel embodied in concrete communities. And I'm also really grateful for our students. I'll just say, over the past 2 years, students have played a leading role at Duke in keeping issues of justice and peace for Jews, Israelis, Palestinians at the forefront. And they have networked with other on-campus groups, Jewish Voice for Peace, Students for Justice in Palestine. And the students are making connections and showing up. And it's been amazing to follow in their wake to a great degree. I wanted to pick up on one thread, too, from something Emilee said earlier about practice and the need to practice. Just been struck with the ways that we learn habits of being in the world. And when Jesus talks in Matthew 25 about encountering him and those who are incarcerated and those who are strangers and those who are hungry or homeless or anyone in need, I think if we can learn to be aware of Jesus' presence in those who are around us, who need us. And I have to think that someone who spends significant time with those who are incarcerated or with young people, adults with intellectual disabilities, we're going to learn habits of being Christian that will also make our hearts more tender and more open to hearing from folks who are in need, not only in Palestine, but in our own communities. And again, this is a strong point, I think, of my experience, both at Princeton and at Duke, is that field education isn't just ticking a box, it's apprenticeship in ministry. And one of the challenges is using their experiences really well in field and bringing that into my classroom. But I think that the idea that you can't just get a degree in divinity and be ready to do ministry, you have to be apprenticed, you have to learn, you have to practice. I think there's real hope in that. I think, if anything, the schools that I've mentioned have leaned into field education and education beyond the classroom as integral to what we're up to in formation. It's a really good thing.
I was really inspired, Emilee, to hear about the creative new questions and ways that you all are having freedom to dream and find new ways to do things. It reminds me, our office has talked a lot about Ted Smith's work, the end of theological education. So I'm hearing a lot of resonance with that. And I do think there's something important in maybe for this conversation in the way that he highlights renunciations and what needs to be renounced in relation to the Christian Zionism that is in the water of our institutions. And, I think importantly, the way that he notes that renunciation precedes vision. And so can we begin with some confession and renunciation? I think the role of grief and lament is sometimes not pondered enough when it comes to the seeing through the suffering of others and of the Palestinians. I think we have some work there. And maybe if we spent some time on that, really, truly grieving, lamenting, for me, in terms of a biblical figure, the character of Rizpah in 2 Samuel is just incredibly instructive. And I'd love to see our institutions spend some time in grief and lament and naming of the names and the lives lost and the families and the stories and the memories, and to see what God's Spirit might do out of pausing in lament. I think we have a lot of hope from our scriptural tradition that could point us to looking to God to act in that.
And I'll just chip in, adding on to what Shannon has said. I think repair is another expression of that grief and lament. And at my institution for, I'd have to go back at least 10 years now, we on a biennial basis offer a course that follows the trail of death that the Potawatomi were forced to make from our region out to Kansas. And so we have built relationships with Potawatomi elders who accompany the group on the trip, and some citizen band Potawatomi who are out in Kansas have come and visited our campus. And we also, through a local historian who's also one of our adjuncts, discovered that there was an Indian trail that went right through our land, our seminary property. And so the work of repair, like when you discover this information, again, going back to something Shannon said too, there are facts that you get to reckon with. And while you have to interpret those facts, that is part of meaning-making work. And that's part of theological education. So I think that there are endless possibilities when there is the political will within the institution to say, yeah, this matters to us. We see this as an extension or maybe even foundational to the gospel that we are trying to share with the world through graduate level theological education, at least in my case.
I think one of the gifts of this conversation is really stressing how important it is for us at theological institutions to learn from one another. I think that in my positionality as a librarian within a theological institution, what I don't see a lot of because of the white colonial pillars that institutions are built of. There's a lot of gatekeeping. There's a lot of, we exist to serve ours first, and primarily the people here that belong here, to the detriment of other people. And so one of the things I think that this conversation really does a lovely job of doing is how important it is for us to talk and learn from one another, and not constantly being reinventing the wheel every time we want to try on something new or approach a new way of being. And so on that, I am just so grateful. I'm so grateful for all of you for being here, for taking the time, and for having this conversation with us. It has been very generative for me personally, and I think that I hope our listeners will find a kernel of inspiration here as they continue to walk on their journeys. So thank you again for being here with us today.
I want to highlight 3 important books, all published very recently, which relate to everything we've discussed today in this conversation, and they are must-read books. The first one, which has already been mentioned, is Theology After Gaza, a global anthology, edited by Mitri Raheb and, I hope I have his name right, Graham McGough. The next book is Being Christian After the Desolation of Gaza, edited by Bruce Fisk and Ross Wagner, our guest today. And finally, The Cross and the Olive Tree, Cultivating Palestinian Theology Amid Gaza, by John Munir and Samuel Munir as editors.
And to our listeners, thank you for tuning in today. And we'll be back next time about how Christian Zionism manifests itself in the South African context.
Thank you, everyone. This has been a phenomenal conversation, very generative. And to our listeners, that wonderful music you're hearing, it's called The Path Forward. And it was written and produced by Carl St. Lucie and Danny Fry, with sampled speech from Reverend Dr. Munther Isaac. ISCZ is a project of Friends of Seville North America, a nonprofit Christian ecumenical organization seeking justice and peace in the Holy Land through education, advocacy, and nonviolent action. To learn more about ISCZ and to support our work, please visit us at studychristianzionism.org.